One fortunate day, Chris was lying in his boat floating in the lake when suddenly his boat was struck by another. It was Anne's boat that struck him, startling the man. The man lashed out at first but was stunned looking at the beautiful girl seated in there. The lady apologized to the man from afar while he was admiring her beauty. The two bid each their farewell while Chris kept smiling over in the lady's direction. Later that day, when Chris was sitting on the hill admiring the sights, the lady approached him once more. He was surprised to see the lovely woman again and invited her to join him, as they sat down and began talking. Chris asked the lady if she knew he was already here, to which the lady replied she didn't, and Chris smiled to himself thinking maybe she was the one he was meant to be with. Soon the two of them got happily married, and Chris held his beloved close to him as they both walked into the church. The years passed and before they knew it the two of them were already parents of two wonderful children, Marie and Ian. While their mother prepared breakfast for the two of them, the kids were at the breakfast table getting ready to go to school. While his father came from his room, Ian informed his mom that he had a game today and would eat there. Chris reminded Ian of his upcoming math test and wished him luck. Chris quickly arrived outside where his son and daughter were seated and handed Marie her lunchbox. Like any other day, he kissed his daughter on the cheek and bade his son goodbye, not realizing that this would be his last meeting with them. The unfortunate deaths of Marie and Ian occurred on the same day, with their bodies resting in the coffin in front of the priest. The priest continued with his speech as their darling children lay lifeless in front of them. The parents were seated in the church, puzzled and traumatized. Chris continued to sob softly while gazing at his son's casket and giving it a little sad smirk. 4 years after the terrible tragedy, Chris was operating on a little girl with migraine in his clinic. His wife called him to wish him a happy anniversary. He had numerous sights in mind for the two of them, but Anne let him know that she was too busy at work, and most likely wouldn't be able to join him this time for their anniversary. Although Chris was upset, he realized the importance and ended the call by telling her he loved her. The following evening, as he was entering a tunnel, a few vehicles collided head-on just in front of him. He quickly exited his car and started rushing toward the crash in the rain. When he arrived, he saw a woman trapped inside a car and offered to help, introducing himself as a doctor. However, before he could react, another vehicle slammed into the man who was standing in the open. He saw a few flashes and sounds, and before he knew it, he was already standing in his home. His dog Ginger came barking at him, when he suddenly heard an unknown man who was blurred from head to toe. Chris asked him who he was and why was he blurred. The mysterious man mentioned that he will become clear when he wishes him to be. Chris ignored the man and proceeded straight to his hallway, where he discovered dozens of men and women with Anne, who was sobbing on a couch in his house. He asked the mysterious man what had happened to him, to which he replied that Chris had already died in an accident. Chris couldn't bring himself to believe the blurred man and was puzzled why nobody could see him. He remembered the time when his daughter Marie sat close to her dog, Katie, who was going through a lot of pain. They planned to put the dog to rest and put an end to its misery, but Marie insisted on staying with her dog and wasn't ready to let go of it. The parents tried to tell the little girl that she couldn't come to the hospital with them, and that Katie will not come back afterward. Marie was mad at her parents. She thought they were trying to eliminate her dog and asked what was going to happen to Katie afterward. Her mother answered that the dog will go to where all people go after they die, telling her how wonderful that place is while Chris stood there the whole time. The next moment, Chris came back to his senses and found himself standing in a church. He could finally see himself, but still not the blurred man in front of him. His wife was dressed in black as a widow as he looked at her up close, touching her lips and cheeks, trying to tell her that he was right here in front of her. However, the woman only felt a touch on her lips and continued listening to the priest, nothing else. Later the same day, Chris and the blurred man were at his house, when he pointed out one of his wife's paintings, where Chris and Anne were depicted on the canvas in the location where the two first met. He went over to his wife, who was at the time following her therapist's advice and recording her thoughts in the diary. After losing each member of her family one by one, she wrote about the immense pain she was experiencing. Chris, who was standing very next to her, kept whispering to her to let her know that he was still nearby, but the woman could not hear him. The woman's hands continued to shake as she scribbled a message on the paper awkwardly, as he tried to write on the paper by controlling her hand. She was unable to understand why she was writing. She quickly completed Chris's message, which stated, "I still exist." He kept whispering to her to open her eyes so she could read the message because he wanted her to. But she tore the diary's paper and continued sobbing. Anne later stood in a field where Chris's body was buried. He asked the blurred man if there was an end to this state he was in, to which the man answered that it will end when he wants it to end. He told Chris that his reality will be over when he stops wanting to hurt Anne. The blurred man then disappeared while Chris was still with her, right behind her the whole time as she read his tombstone, which read, "A beloved father and husband forever." Chris repeated after the tombstone, whispering in her ears once again. Anne started crying and screaming, not being able to forget Chris and hearing his voice. Chris at last understood the suffering Anne was going through because of him. With one final goodbye to his love, the man vanished into nothing. While looking behind her, Anne sensed something once more but couldn't find anything. Chris awakened on the ground in a flower-filled field covered in flowers of every color imaginable. He attempted to take one of the strange-looking flowers in his hands, but was surprised to find that they were painted. He sensed a familiar feeling approaching him all of a sudden. It was his dog Katie, who passed away a long time ago. Katie gave its owner a warm embrace as she welcomed Chris back. The two walked through the huge, colorful landscape until Chris came to a scene he was familiar with. He was portrayed in his wife's artwork, the one where he was seen standing next to a river and a field bursting with flowers. The couple had imagined spending the rest of their lives together in a little house on the opposite side of the river, just like in the painting. Glancing at the stunning environment of which he had always dreamed, he screamed with excitement. When Chris finally crossed the fields and arrived at the river's edge, he found himself stuck inside the puddle and once more heard a similar voice. He recognized it as his former mentor, Dr. Albert Lewis, who was standing above the river. Chris could now clearly picture Albert, and recognized that the hazy man he had been speaking with ever since he died was actually Albert. He requested Albert's assistance, and after Albert revealed that Chris had created his wonderful universe, the two began to converse. Chris noted that his wife didn't draw many of the scenes he was seeing, that had a bird in the sky after the man brought it up. Albert assured him once more that it was all in his mind and that it would move if he so desired. When Chris heard this, the bird began to move from its still position and changed colors while Chris played with it. The two then crossed the river while discussing what they would be, if they no longer had a body or even a brain. Albert then reminded Chris that his wife had sketched a house for the two. The two continued to discuss what is genuinely real as they sat down in Chris's imaginary home. Albert continued by saying that the true world is a person's imagination, because the physical world is just an illusion and somewhat unreal. Albert made a hole in the house's wall which was made out of paint. Chris gazed through the hole and beheld a stunning world that was not a work of art but rather existed in reality. His friend told Chris that it was him who was making all of this and that he didn't need the paints anymore. It was his world and he could make it however he liked. Anne was staring at the artwork she had created for the two, while she was back in the world of the living. She grabbed up a new canvas and began drawing in the hopes that Chris would see it, because she could feel like he was still there and not away. Meanwhile, Chris noticed something odd while Chris and Albert were strolling around his universe. Chris stated that he had never seen such a tree in Anne's drawings and that he had not also imagined it. It was a purple tree located far out in the fields. He was gazing at the tree when all of a sudden Anne appeared, waving a red cloth just like when they first met. The woman, however, dropped her cloth, and when Chris saw this, he figured out that he wanted to go to her as quickly as possible. He considered jumping from the cliff as he looked over it, but his friend Albert advised against it. Chris nevertheless made the leap. Excitedly, he yelled as he felt himself drop down and hit the ground. Chris hurried over to the tree and discovered Albert standing just behind him. Chris wondered how he could see her painting even though they were in different worlds, to which Albert replied that it was a very rare phenomenon that only occurs with soulmates. However, before they could come to a conclusion, the leaves of the tree started shedding quickly. This was because over at her place, Anne spilled a paint remover over the drawing, knowing for a fact that Chris won't be able to see it no matter how she makes it. When Chris saw the tree losing all of its leaves, he sobbed and yelled her name, which echoed all the way to Anne. The two of them kept walking, when they came across his wife once again behind them, as she dove into the river as the two of them continued to travel and explore Chris's imagination. Albert urged his friend to put an end to his fantasies and discover a new purpose in life. Chris, on the other hand, unwilling to let go of his children's and wife's memories. He started searching anxiously for his daughter Marie after discovering a toy that belonged to her. Chris desperately questioned Albert about why he hadn't yet met his kids and where he could find them. Everyone in this world is free to use their own imagination, according to Albert, who also said that his children must be somewhere in the universe, and that he will find them when he searches. Hearing this, Chris recalled the time when his sick daughter had asked him to teach her to play chess, and he hugged the toy closer to himself. He was lying in a house, isolated. He got out of the house to find a woman, who greeted him saying that Albert was busy somewhere else, and she will be the one to accompany him today. Chris read a badge that was on the lady's dress. It read Leona. The lady mentioned that Albert had told her about Chris's struggle to forget about his family. She offered him some assistance, suggesting him to go and see other people, or even cities, and closing his eyes with her hands. When she removed her hand, revealing the scenery to Chris, it was a beautiful landscape, almost seeming like the heaven itself, with people flying around and children playing in the waters. The lady asked Chris about his family, to which he revealed about his wife and his children who passed away years ago in a car crash. When Chris asked about Albert's whereabouts, she told him that he helps new souls adapt to their new lives. The two then sat on a boat and sailed across the magical waters there, and started talking while on the boat. The lady asked Chris to tell her any stories from the past, to which the man recalled the time he and Marie were sitting in her bedroom, looking at the sculpture of a scene in heaven beside her bedside. The young girl asked whether or not everyone goes to heaven after death. Chris replied that it was merely a dream, a lovely one but unreal. He asked Marie to go to bed because she didn't appear to like his answer, but she insisted on playing chess with her father until she won. Chris continued saying that Marie died 3 months after that incident, and she never won. The lady also narrated a story to him, saying that her name wasn't actually Leona and this wasn't her body either. Hearing this, something seemed very similar to Chris when he looked around in the lady's dream. The scenery and the people in the scenery were very similar to the sculpture that Marie used to have in her room. Chris looked over at her and asked her if she still plays chess. This time it was his beloved daughter, sitting right in front of him. Upon finally seeing his daughter after such a long time, both of them embraced each other while sobbing the whole time. In her bedroom, Anne was looking at the mirror, thinking and regretting how she never got to say her goodbyes to any of her family members. She wrote in the diary about how terrible she felt for not being able to tell Chris that she loved him one last time before they parted. Albert was back from his errand and greeted Chris. However, he had something unpleasant to tell Chris. He asked Chris to stay calm and sat beside him, and revealed that Anne had put herself to eternal sleep back at their home. Chris felt an immense pain, but he thought to himself that now she can be with him once again in this world. However, there was more to the unfortunate news. Albert explained that the people who committed suicide don't reach the world where Chris and Albert were, but instead they go to a place somewhere completely different. He was never going to meet Anne again in his life. Chris was puzzled and couldn't comprehend Albert's words at first. He yelled in rage, grabbed Albert by the collar, and sobbed, asking why such things were happening to him, and why he was not allowed to reunite with his beloved wife once more. Albert tried to calm the man down, but it was of no use. After thinking to himself for a while, Chris decided that he will find Anne himself, saying that if there were no rules it should be possible to bring someone back from suicide as well. Albert told him that no one had ever seen someone coming back after committing suicide, and that the ones who committed are left spending their life for eternity not even realizing that they are already dead. But Chris was not ready to listen to anyone telling him that he can't meet Anne again, and was determined to meet her. Eventually, Albert gave in to his request and the two left to prepare for the long journey across the land of dreams. An elderly man that Albert and Chris met warned them that the place they planned to visit was extremely dangerous, and there was no guarantee that Anne would remember or even recognize Chris when he eventually found her. All he would be able to do, he added, was wish her goodbye. Chris disregarded the man's advice and did as he was told. He closed his eyes. When Chris opened his eyes once more, the three were once again traveling on a boat. He saw a pitch-black sky, rumbling clouds, and oceans swarming with people attempting to sink their boat. The elderly man told Chris that people usually lose their minds when they come here, and told him to stay strong in his motive. The men of the boat made numerous attempts to drive the people in the water away, but they were ultimately unsuccessful and drowned in the water. Chris recalled the day when his kid questioned him for kicking him out of school without consulting him first. Ian admitted to his father that while he might not be as smart or as excellent a student as his father, he was still determined to succeed and was willing to try. At that time, Chris was extremely proud of his son. When Chris finally gained consciousness, the three continued their journey on land, where there were flames and people were screaming all over the place. Chris looked around at the horrible place before he saw Albert walking into a group of people holding dangerous weapons and not appearing to stop. Chris realized that Albert was no one else but Ian, who was trying to look for his mother. Chris screamed at Albert, telling him that he won't find his mother there. The man was surprised to see his father recognized him, and the two embraced each other. The father and son were overjoyed to see each other, but the elderly man standing next to them wasn't pleased and told Chris that he wouldn't be able to see his wife any longer because his feelings were now focused on his kid, and he wouldn't focus on his quest to find her. Chris reacted angrily, saying he would just have to focus more and that he wished he could go on the trip with his son. Ian initially expressed the want to find his mother with his father, but he quickly finally realized that now wasn't the time, and he convinced his father that the only thing that mattered at the moment was for Chris to find his wife. Chris left with the elderly guy, but Ian stayed behind and advised his father to keep his head straight by recalling the moment he lost his children. When their children died after some time, Anne lost her mind and was then admitted into a mental institution, as his wife had instructed, and Chris was once more trapped in his memories. She wanted a divorce since they were too different to stay together, even remarking why Chris didn't go mad after losing his children. Chris held her hand tightly as he added that he loved his children very much, and that he felt devastated, but assured her that things would get better, and that they should focus on what was ahead rather than what had already happened. Chris was lost in his thoughts when the two arrived at a strange place, where people were buried neck deep in the ground. He moved past them and rushed when he saw Anne also stuck there. He dashed in her direction and was just about to reach her when unfortunately the floor broke, and he fell down the water below. The elderly guy soon joined him, and the two traveled together until Chris came across what appeared to be his crumbling home. The elderly guy cautioned him not to stay there for too long or he would go insane just as he was about to enter. Additionally, he disclosed his true identity. He was the genuine Dr. Albert, the one who trained Chris while he was inhabiting the body of the white elderly guy. Chris expressed his gratitude that his instructor will continue to mentor him after death and promised to be there to greet him. When Chris went inside the crumbled place and found his wife sitting by the side of the water fountain that was now completely dry, she was startled by seeing him and asked him who he was as she couldn't recognize him. He lied to Anne that he was her new neighbor who just shifted and had come there to greet her. Anne mentioned to him that the neighborhood was now silent and there was no water or flowers. She couldn't even find her paintings that reminded her of someone very special, about which she still couldn't figure out. Chris decided to tell her his side of the story, and about their special anniversary that no one else besides them knew about. After the deaths of their children, Anne was silent and in extreme pain when one day Chris visited her like every day. However, this time he held a letter in his hand, and told her that it was the divorce letter for the two. He apologized to her that he couldn't join her in her agony and left her behind to go through all that pain. Chris kept sobbing and apologizing in front of her, but the woman wouldn't answer. He then kissed her head one last time and was just about to leave, when Anne grabbed his hand sobbing and tore the letter apart. Back in her dream, Anne remarked that she failed her husband and her children, to which Chris replied that he was the real coward of the two and that he had pushed himself so apart that he was no longer a part of his wife's pain. Hearing this, Anne said that she wanted to see Chris, still not recognizing that he was right in front of her. Chris asked her to close her eyes and think of their wedding. He tried to remind her yet again that he was right there in front of her, but the woman snapped out of her dream and ran away from Chris, shutting the door close. Chris came close to her one last time, thanking her for all the wonderful things she gave him in his life, his children, the happiness, and even the quarrels. He once again asked her for forgiveness for every time he failed her, including this time, as he couldn't bring her back, and walked away from her. The man left the house to see the old man waiting for him. He mentioned that he was just about to lose his mind, and that he had made up his mind and given up the thought of bringing her back. However, he meant something entirely different. He requested Albert to say his goodbyes to his children and tell them that he loved them. He had decided that he will stay in hell if it meant he could stay with Anne. The old man respected his decision as he nodded to him, and Chris closed the door to his home and stayed inside with Anne. Chris sat with Anne and told her that he was ready to spend an eternity with her, even if it was in hell. Seeing him like this, Anne's memories started to come back to her. However, the same were seeping out of Chris, and he forgot everything about the two and himself. Anne tried reminding him of her, when he found himself drowning in the water, and her voice is growing dimmer and dimmer. The next moment, Chris was lying in his own universe once again. When he got out, he was extremely overjoyed to see his Anne behind him. The two were reunited and kissed each other out of love. Chris then showed his wife the scenery she always dreamt of having in her dreams, and paintings finally in front of her eyes. She couldn't be happier when Albert came to the two, and gave her the happiest surprise in her life when her old dog ran up to her. But she found that there was much more to that surprise when she heard her daughter Marie's voice from behind her, and saw her son Ian. She embraced her children close to herself as she sobbed in happiness to see the family finally reunited. After a while, Anne asked Chris if they could grow old together in this world as they were walking together. Chris said that he had something even more incredible planned. He wanted to be reborn beside his wife so that he could once more share in her love and be married to her. Anne agreed with his request, and the two hugged each other as they were about to be reborn as soulmates once again. In a different life, a girl standing next to a youngster accidentally hit his toy boat. They both laughed at it together. As they chuckled at one another and began to fall in love, the young girl offered the lad a sandwich. The romance between Chris and Anne went on once again from there.